Chapter 29. Dad. It was Dad who made my hometown interesting. Dad could take all the grubby areas we drive past all the time and superimpose an image from the past over top of them, making them charming and intriguing. There's a seedy corner with a grubby bit of a field just before a small plaza with a gas station and a coffee shop. It's across the street from a very seedy, very run-down motel. Dad would be driving along and point out that area and say how it used to be this big green field, and on Sundays in my great-grandfather's day, British immigrants would picnic there and play soccer. I could picture that in my mind, people dressed in fine clothes on a lovely green space, and create that as a slide that I could hold mentally over top the rundown spot it had become. He could do that all over the place because he was a wealth of interesting anecdotal and historical details, and it made the city seem colorful, rich, and unique. I think Dad knew where every street in the city was, and not just because he was a fireman and then the fire chief of not one but two areas. He would always know his north, south, east, and west, and he was always amusedly perplexed that I didn't. I remember saying I had no idea what direction north was when I was going somewhere one time, got lost, and had to call Dad for directions many years ago. He said, "Shorty, what side of you is the lake on?" I didn't know. I wasn't near the lake. So what happens when driving inner city? Dad didn't understand how that would make a difference. He just knew. Dad was born the youngest of 7 children in the 1940s. He and his family lived in a big old house in the south end of town, from Dad's own writings. The house was very old and dated from the 1800s. The lot was approximately 315 feet by 85 feet. It had a 2-car garage with a part on the east end that was used as a chicken coop. There was a fenced enclosure for the chickens to run. We had peach, cherry, apple, and pear trees. For many years, Dad planted a lot of vegetables like potatoes, carrots, beans, peas, etc. I've told you that the year Papa cleaned out the catch basin and spread the human fertilizer on the garden, and we had the best tomato crop ever. Dad was trying to write his life story before he died. He had written a good portion at one point, but because Dad was Dad, he left his laptop in his unlocked vehicle while at a friend's house, and it got stolen. Dad was still stuck in that generation where you could leave your house and car unlocked, and when you made an agreement with someone, shaking on it meant you would honor that agreement. I remember Dad telling us that one day about how my grandfather, Papa, had to clean out their septic tank, and how he spread what he cleaned out all over their garden. While we were all reeling in horror and revulsion, especially Mom, Dad insisted that those were the best tomatoes that they ever had that year. And when we were still groaning over it, he said, "What? Nothing ever happened to us from eating them." Dad was a great storyteller and had a lot of interesting stories to tell, like how, at 5 years old, he tried kindergarten for one day, found it horrifying, and Nanny let him skip that whole year. When he started back in grade 1, he was so anxious they let his brother, who was closest to Dad in age, sit with him in class a few times. Or how he rode his bike with friends to go swimming at the beach I stay at every summer with my family. That beach is over 30 kilometers away, or close to 20 miles, and Dad rode his bike there down mostly gravel country roads, swam all day, and had to ride back one time just as a massive thunderstorm blew in. When I was a kid, Dad was everything. As Mom was mostly standoffish, annoyed, and disapproving, Dad was cheerful, easygoing, and warm. Dad had no problem showing us that he loved us, being very vocal with affection and never got tired of giving hugs. He always gave me pep talks and tried to boost my self-esteem, even though it didn't really seem to work. I remember sitting on his and Mom's bed sometime between kindergarten and grade 1. I was fretting. I asked Dad, "What happens if in grade 1 they ask me what 100 plus 100 is?" "Well," Dad said, "what's 1 plus 1? 2? Well then, what's 100 plus 100? Me, thinking, 200? That's right. I never forgot how relieved that made me feel. I just wanted to drive around and go everywhere Daddy was. When I was little and he was out in the backyard working without a shirt, I wanted to be shirtless. Mom didn't think that was the best idea. He had ridiculous nicknames for me. Shorty the shortcake, the shortest cake in town. Shorty O'Grady, a real fine lady. Short pie. And of course, just Shorty, or Short, which Dad and Mom called me. Nini Piccolini, and he'd bounce me on his knee when I was very small and turn that one into a song. Oh, Nini Piccolini is my best gal friend. 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 The bouncing would get faster and faster and would include tickles at the end. He never seemed to get embarrassed. Ever. That time he said, "Come on, Short, let's go rent a video." And he hopped into the car with no shoes because he'd been enjoying his summer backyard, and we drove over to the convenience store, and in Dad walked, unabashed, across the filthy floor in his bare feet, while teen Karen was inwardly dying of embarrassment. Dad did not care. He never seemed scared of anything. He seemed to move fearlessly through life, almost boorishly. He was always lovable despite his appreciable ego. He was ambitious and worked his way up through the ranks to fire chief. He seemed to know how everything worked. Plumbing, electricity, you name it. I grew up thinking that all men either knew or should know how to fix anything around the house, and I still get inwardly and unfairly impatient and annoyed when Hubs doesn't just know how to or have the initiative to fix whatever is wrong with our house. Dad was from that generation where men just knew how to do all these things. He built the garage, 2 sheds, our back TV room, and the deck, with help of course. He was interested in politics, history, cars with hot rod engines, had an endless curiosity and thirst for more knowledge. And to me it always showed how a person could prove that a piece of paper with a degree on it could be meaningless by comparison. There was Dad, who dropped out of grade 12, and you could ask him a question about nearly anything and he'd know the answer. Dad was my hero. He was the reason why, for the longest time, I would believe there could be someone, especially a man, who could just come to my rescue. He seemed to do that for us for so long. If ever we were in a situation where we needed someone, Dad was there. He just made me feel safe. He was so logical, calm, and rational about everything, and empathetic. He never forgot what it felt like to be a kid, and that made a big impression on me. What we didn't realize was that all of that confidence and that anchored assuredness existed because of Mom. They often seemed annoyed with one another, or Mom often seemed annoyed with Dad. They were often bickering over some stupid little thing, but what we didn't know was that Dad, who was a huge personality and a bit more than eccentric, was actually grounded by sensible, practical Mom. We found that out when we found out Mom was really, really sick. That day the doctor told Mom in the hospital that she was dying, and there was nothing that could be done. I was at home. Brother and Dad were still at the hospital. It hit all of them like a ton of bricks. Was my sister there too? I can't remember now. Brother called me in tears and said it was bad, and I had to come to the hospital and he was coming to pick me up. By the time we arrived back, I'll never forget it. We were going to park the car, and Dad was in the parking lot and he was just wandering. He was pale and terrified and confused. He was muttering and crying and trying to find his car, and he could not remember where it was. He was in a panic and beside himself. I had never, ever seen Dad like that before. Never. It was like something in Dad broke that day. He was still Dad after that, but he was never the same Dad as he was before. Mom's death ruined Dad. He never recovered from it. He had a plan, a rock-solid plan, and he was stunned that his plan didn't go, well, according to plan. His plan was that he would work and save as much money as possible so that when he retired, he and Mom could live comfortably and go on a few nice vacations, but most of all, Mom would be taken care of for life, because he was going to die first. That was the plan. Mom's upset to the plan rattled Dad cataclysmically. He was actually dumbfounded. This was not the way things were supposed to go. He didn't have any backup plans because that was somehow the only plan he could have ever envisioned. He lived nearly 4 years after that, and he could have good moments, but he never seemed to make any progress. He would seem to be better for a while, and then he would loop back down the bottom of his emotional well. He'd be visiting one of us, and we'd think he was so much better. We'd feel so relieved. We'd secretly text one another, "Dad seems really good today." "Does he? That's good." But then Dad would start breaking down again, and he'd race off in tears. He was lost. He was unanchored, untethered, like a small boat on a vast, violently churning ocean. He never seemed to choose things to eat in restaurants that he actually liked ever again, because Mom was never there to say, "Don't get that! You won't like that! Get this instead!" He was so happy with constant guidance, and when Mom got annoyed with things he did, it was like a navigation tool to put him back on the right focused track. And now that was gone. He started to date women. All of these women came out of the woodwork, and they all liked Dad because he was smart and charismatic. In short, he was charming. But he didn't really like any of these women because all he truly wanted was Mom. And I believe he felt compelled to endlessly search and search and search to try to find her. I understand this in a way. After Mom died, sometimes I would see a lady who, from a certain angle, would look a tiny bit like Mom, but there is nobody to replace that lost loved one. This new Dad was exasperating. He came over to my house all the time, and I disliked him at first, and I hated those visits because he wasn't the same, and because he was coming over to complain to me about some of the women he was dating, and what lousy cooks they were, and how annoying they were, and how clingy they were, and he'd vent and vent and vent, and I'd try over and over again to brainstorm and come up with solutions for everything that made him upset. And I'd try to tell him that I felt he had complicated grief, and I'd try to give him ideas about how to organize his fridge, or simple meals he could make for himself, or anything to help him feel better, but he wouldn't do any of it. And then he would be back not long after to repeat that whole thing. I'd be flailing around trying to find that dinner I could make that would actually make him enthused, but I knew I could never do that right balance of salty, sweet, sour that Mom could do, and it would make Dad unhappy. He drove me crazy, but as time went on, I got used to the new Dad, and I looked forward to Sunday pre-dinner cocktails out on the porch. Dad's anguish was immense. First, he was crippled for a while by debilitating back pain. Then he started to have problems with his walking. Then he started to have trouble breathing. My sister and I were staying with Dad at a condo he'd rented in Florida the year he suddenly couldn't breathe very well at all. He was completely freaked, even though he tried not to show it, and spent a great deal of his time sitting in a chair in the living room, binge-watching episodes of Cheers on his computer. With Dad's health, there was never going to be any good news ever again. There would never be a respite from intense stress and fear. Things would just get worse and worse until he died. Every visit to the bigger hospitals in Hamilton just seemed to bring worse news, like that time we were all sitting together in one of those slightly grimy hospital examining rooms with the specialist. It's not ALS, but it's like ALS, so for all intents and purposes, we'll just call it ALS. Seriously? What the fuck? That may have been the drive home where I was like, "Say, Dad, old chum, how about one of those tiny little anxiety pills you carry around with you all the time now? I sure could go for one of those." Or maybe that was the drive home after the first specialist dropped the bomb that basically we were fucked. This was the last year of Dad's life. A nightmarish, constantly worrying, convoluted struggle to get enough in-home care, fill in those 24 hours where there were no personal support workers. Angels on earth, those personal support workers, let me tell you. Try to get things installed in the house to help Dad's mobility, like the stair lift and that electronic lazy boy that practically tipped him out onto his feet. Hardware for the tub, meals sent to the house that Dad hated and complained about and didn't eat until we canceled them. And oh, those breathing machines. I personally found the breathing machine absolutely horrifying. See, sometimes Dad had to switch face masks. The one that fit over his nose and mouth caused a super sore divot in the skin on the bridge of his nose over time. And the mask that was just the nose piece allowed him to talk with us better. If only it was just a simple matter of plugging one in and out and swapping it for the other. It involved taking Dad's mask off, hooking up the other mask, and getting it affixed properly onto his face. The amount of time Dad basically spent not breathing depended on how fast you could get everything hooked up. It was fucking horrific. I'd take off his mask and I could feel the seconds ticking by that he was sitting there without air, my hands shaking. Sister was much better at the breathing machine. It intimidated me so badly. Time passed, and Dad made sure we all came by most Friday nights for a Fat Man's Friday Night Fish Fry. A little dark humor there, considering Dad was no longer anywhere near the solid, vibrant man he had once been. This is where we'd all pretend that everything was great, and wasted, weak, decrepit Dad, sitting in his electronic lazy boy, would hand Hubs his bank card, remind him of the PIN number, and tell him to go out and get all of us fish and chips. And then everyone would eat except Dad, because swallowing was getting really hard for him. Talking was getting worse and worse, and if he had that full-face plastic mask on and was trying to ask us a question, forget it. I secretly hated those get-togethers, pretending everything was just hunky-dory, trying to calm my nerves with a stiff cocktail. Then there was that time that Dad fell out of the stair lift at the top of the stairs landing and couldn't get up, and the person who Dad paid to live at the house so someone would always be there at night couldn't lift him. That freaked poor Dad out so badly, no anti-anxiety pill could touch his terror that night. In the end, that awful day came where Dad went off to the hospital in an ambulance. The ambulance drivers weren't familiar with Dad's breathing machine. I can't even remember what had happened that sent him there. He was in emergency for a while and just endlessly panicking. Endlessly. At some point I was on the phone with a specialist in Hamilton. I was pleading for something. I don't even know what I was pleading for. Eventually, Dad got moved to intensive care. I don't know. Imagine if you could know how long you would be in an intensely draining, stressful situation. If you could only know that it would last X number of hours or days, would it make things any better? If I had known that we had 2 weeks left with Dad, would it have made any of us more patient, more willing to do anything, more willing to just keep going? Dad would not be left alone for a moment. My siblings and I and one of our aunts split shifts. Brother stayed overnight a few times. The horror. I couldn't imagine staying there overnight. Dad was on morphine most of the time, which helped his anxiety a bit, but made him itchy all the time. I would have to give him back scratches with the hairbrush over his scrawny back, every bone visible. What a terrible contrast to all those back scratches I gave Dad as a kid, just because Daddy loved a back scratch. So many other horrors in that hospital room, but I'll leave those to your imagination. In the end, there came a day where Dad was dying, and we were in that room, in intensive care, with the privacy curtains drawn, listening to the hospital sounds, the machines Dad was hooked up to. Dad was insistent. We had to find that song that reminded him of Mom on his laptop. We couldn't find it. He made us look again. We were nearly in a panic by the time we finally found it. onward to death. An agonizing, seemingly endless, drudging march to the end, losing my mind trying to keep it together in there. By about 10:30 that dark night in March, he was gone. My dad was gone. Just short of 4 years after we'd lost Mum. My siblings, my aunt, and I hugged each other in that dim, empty, late-night hospital entranceway, and then we went home. I got home and made Dad's favorite drink, rum and Coke with a squeeze of lemon. It was terrible. Rum was never my drink, and sorry, Dad, but I especially hated the squeeze of lemon. The hospital bed we'd been waiting for arrived at Dad's house while he was in the hospital. That would have to go back. How do you dismantle a lifetime of people you love? A house literally and figuratively filled with memories. Our family home of nearly 50 years. I would find out, and it would break my damn heart.